Now, despite the challenges Nigeria's democracy has endured with successive elections and peaceful transfers of power. Now, to help us explore the complexities and achievements of Nigeria's Fourth Republic, we have with us today journalist and author David Hundeyin. David, you're welcome. Good to have you here. David, can you hear us? Unfortunately, I can't hear you.
There you are.
Good. Now, David, let's start with the end of the military rule in 1999. What were the key factors that led to the military decision to transition to a civil government?
Well, at that point in time, the military administration of Abdulsalam Abubakar was what you would call a lame duck. It was out of options. So throughout the 5 years of 4 years of General Abacha's administration, there had been a running battle, not just with obviously Nigerian civil society and the likes of NADECO, but also internationally, which I think is a story that isn't told often enough. General Abacha was very much perceived, at least in Western circles, to be some sort of anti-Western postured head of state. And for that to be the case in what was then Africa's largest oil producer, which was, and then I think the world's 8th largest oil producer, was a significant problem, at least as far as the Western power brokers were concerned. So there was a whole international leg of the sort of anti-Abacha or the anti-military struggle in Nigeria that I think isn't known about enough. So by the time General Abacha died, under the very unclear circumstances that he did, because just to be clear, we still don't know what actually killed General Abacha. We have been told officially that it was a heart attack. And that's it. We've not been offered any further information beyond that. So at that point, it's easy to analyze it from the point of view of General Abubakar, thinking, well, if I, first of all, am I even qualified to take on this fight that Abacha took on, carried on his head for 4 years? Am I really that guy? I don't think I am. And then secondly, now that I have sort of accidentally found my way into this seat, how long am I even going to last if I decide to do what Abacha has done, or what Babangida did before him, or Buhari before that, or Murtala, or General Murtala before that, or go on before that, because if you check through Nigeria's post-Civil War history, it has never happened, with the exception of General Babangida, who became known as the evil genius because of that. It was unheard of for a military administration to last more than 6 years. There was always a coup that would terminate it. Right? So he knew that it was only going to be a matter of time before his head would be on the chopping block as well. So it was almost like a decision by default that, well, this is as far as this thing can go. This military adventure we have had for the best part of 20 years now, it's time to terminate it. So that also explains why even the transition to democracy was as sort of haphazard and poorly planned as it was. There wasn't really that genuine desire to set Nigeria up for proper internal democracy and a fundamental change in its style of governance. It was pretty much just, well.
So David.
Sorry.
Yes, David, I wanted to pick on that word you just used, that style. And to do that, I'm going to refer to some past military dictators and also heads of states. Let's talk about Olusegun Obasanjo at one time. Let's talk about Musa Yar'Adua. Let's talk about Muhammadu Buhari. Now, these were at one time or the other military heads of states. And also at another time, there were presidents of the Nigerian system. So are there implications to our democracy that we've had these people serve as military heads and also as presidents? Has it worked well for our democracy currently?
No, it has not. And I think even the very fact that people who served as unelected military dictators who took power by force of arms have been able to come in and become democratically elected presidents under the supposedly democratic Fourth Republic is in itself an indictment on the nature of the Fourth Republic. Because as I was saying, the transition between the military and, well, let me not call it democracy, let me say civilian rule in '99 was done in such a way that the people, the Nigerian people, didn't really have a say in that process. So the 1999 Constitution has as its first line, "We the people." That line is not true because we the people were never at any point consulted regarding the contents of that Constitution. The Constitution, by the way, remains one of the most problematic things about our continued existence as a nation, because there are several parts of that Constitution that people were never consulted on. It was imposed on 100 and something million plus Nigerians by fiat at the time. That also spills over into even the nature of the electoral system that was put into place at the time. So the party now known as the PDP, which was a party that was created as a sort of elite consensus thing in 1998, like it was a sort of special purpose vehicle to bring together the interests of the ruling military establishment with those of the pro-democracy civilian establishments and the politicians from the old First and Second Republic, and sort of, merge them into one thing. And that's what became known as the PDP. And, were it not for the very unexpected transfer of power that took place in 2015, it would still be the case that Nigeria would essentially be ruled by a political party which was not, in fact, put together by a number of people with similar political ideologies or interests. It was just elite consensus, completely disparate interests, people from different parts of the country who do not share any ideology whatsoever, who couldn't even express what their political goals or ideology or philosophies are. It was just power, sharing power. That's it. So even the well-intentioned things like the rotational power principle inadvertently exposes the reasoning behind those who set up the Fourth Republic. That is just, okay, let's share power so that we don't have an Abacha sort of situation again, which, by the way, is not something bad. I think it was a pragmatic way of doing things. But at the same time, it just goes to show that the Nigerian people were never at any point really considered to be an actual stakeholder in what was supposed to be a democracy, which I think violates the principle of democracy.
Of democracy, the very tenets of democracy. David, I would like to more dig into that school of thought that you just shared with us. That you raise very pertinent issues in terms of national identity and unity and the very tenets of democracy, which is at the very aim of it is for the people. But we need to take a short break to bring sports. So we would beg you to hang in tight with us.
We still have David Hundeyin on with us. Now, we were talking about the Fourth Republic from before, to which I asked many, many questions. I'm going to give you the opportunity to ask him a couple more questions.
Right.
David.
Yeah, but David, thank you so much for being so kind and just, being on standby for the last 1 hour. We appreciate you for doing this with us. Now, before the break, you were talking about, the very tenets of democracy in and of itself. And the most important and the most integral part of democracy is the grassroots democracy, which is, for the people, by the people, which is really the definition of democracy when you think about it. And you made a case and say, you argued that it's not been that way, even with this Fourth Republic, and the people have been so far removed when it comes to the dividends of democracy. And I'd like for you to talk on that. But before we go on there, one of the things of the Fourth Republic was that it was going to address one of the issues, or some issues that have plagued the entirety of our democracy, both in the First, Second, and Third Republic, and that is corruption and governance, right? And so what further steps are, should this government, this government they've tried to do it with EFCC and other, agencies that are supposed to be fighting or curbing economic crimes and corruption, but we still see this in present day time. So what are the further steps that we need to necessary to enhance transparency, most importantly, and accountability in this government?
So, well, speaking from the point of view of someone who likes to analyze things from the bigger picture, I think it's fair to say that merely going after the symptom that is corruption, this corruption itself is a symptom of a larger problem. So merely setting up your ICPCs and your EFCCs and giving the police more teeth will have some effect, but if the systemic issue underlying all of this isn't addressed, those things can actually end up becoming even parts of the corruption, which I think it's fair to say has happened. So I think Nigeria's primary problem in the corruption space is an economic one. The problem boils down to the fact that A, the Nigerian economy is too small compared to the number of people there are in Nigeria who are competing for resources, and B, the Nigerian state remains the wealthiest or the most economically powerful entity in Nigeria. Consequently, that means that anyone who is hoping to make a lot of money in a very short period of time needs to gravitate toward government in Nigeria, which is exactly what we don't want, because that's exactly where corruption comes from, right? There is the expectation that the Nigerian government is this huge pork barrel, is this reservoir of a never-ending sea of oil money, basically. So all you need to do is find a way, come up with a device, a scheme for sticking your fork into the barrel and taking as big a piece as you can manage. There was I forget the person who it is, but there was a phrase that I heard from someone who used to be involved in the annual budgeting process, and this phrase has never left my mind. He said, whenever you're in those rooms where decisions are being made at be it federal level or state level, that Nigeria becomes an orphan because nobody cares about Nigeria's interests in those rooms. Everybody's just looking for what will benefit them. So that basic problem that gives birth to that corruption that we witness on a visceral basis is an economic problem. The economy is too small. And there's the belief that not only is the government the easiest or the most reliable way to get access to your financial self-actualization, but that it's, in some cases, it's the only way. So those of us who maybe we grew up in the big cities or whatnot, we might not necessarily see the government as the be-all and end-all because we are visually familiar with what non-governmental prosperity looks like. But if you grew up in some village in Bayelsa and the only people you have ever seen in your life who are not existing in the same miserable poverty as you are people who are in or around the government, then you are visually unfamiliar with the idea that financial self-actualization or comfort is something that can be done outside of getting access to government money. And you will then dedicate yourself to trying to get a piece of that government money, which is, what leads to what we know as corruption. So there needs to be a sort of reordering of the Nigerian economic system that makes it such that the creation of wealth, the private creation of wealth, becomes easier and more accessible to people. That can be done through several means. It can be done, for example, through increasing the amount of power that is generated and distributed across Nigeria, because as you may well know, there's a very simple calculation in development economics that the greater the amount of electricity that is generated in your economy, the wealthier your economy is. The less the amount of electric power you generate and consume, the poorer you are. So the power generation in itself is a very simple hack to creating more wealth in private hands in Nigeria outside of the government. It could be through investments in transport infrastructure, which makes trade with each other easier. That's one way of increasing the velocity with which goods and services move around the economy, which creates more wealth in private hands, which removes the need for people to think that the only way they can get access to financial comfort and self-actualization is by getting their hands into the government pie. So, but there are several other ways of doing this, but these are just
in creating this, this wealth that you're talking about. There are challenges that the Fourth Republic is facing, and it is increased, in the protracted time between 1999 and present now 15th of June 2024, and that's from insurgency to let's see now, banditry, terrorism, insecurity, kidnapping. I could go on. The list is endless. In trying to do that, I mean, all of this I just mentioned would definitely be in the way, wouldn't it? So do you think that from 1999 till now, the policies that have been implemented is helping or not helping? I know this is this question. You might bite me for this question, but humor me, please.
So I think maybe for the first 16 years of the Fourth Republic, definitely, I mean, numbers don't tell lies. So if I'm not mistaken, the lowest amount of annual economic growth that took place within those 16 years was about 4%. That was the least. As at when the economy was being handed over from Goodluck Jonathan to Muhammadu Buhari, which was in 2015, Nigeria was actually the third fastest growing economy, 7%, behind only Qatar and China. Numbers don't tell lies. So some of those things, I wouldn't say a lot of those things, but some of those things were being done. So under the Obasanjo administration, for example, one thing that I will always credit him with, for all the multiple failings that can be cited, but the one thing that can never be taken away from the Obasanjo administration was the liberalization of the telecom space. That on its own created incredible compounding returns in terms of private wealth creation in Nigeria. So as of 1999, ICT was a non-factor in Nigeria's GDP calculation. It was basically negligible, zero. As at today, ICT stands at, I think, about 16% of Nigeria's GDP. And a lot of that is held up by the involvement of businesses which simply didn't exist as of 1999. So businesses like MTN, for example, or Airtel. These are entities that simply couldn't have existed if this space was not liberalized, which was a government policy. Right? Because there was the option to either keep on stoning more money at Nitel, the everlasting money pit that was Nitel, which, by the way, many people in government favored. If you might recall, a certain Adams Oshiomhole came out and wrote a very powerful, impassioned public defense saying that under no circumstances should the telephony space be opened up to private capital. The capitalists are going to exploit the people. Nitel there should be more investment into Nitel and yada, yada, yada. I think time has given its very clear verdict on these things after all these years. That was one space. Under the Yar'Adua administration, there were a few other reforms that took place. Under the Goodluck Jonathan administration, quite notably, I think one of the most important things that was done, maybe in a governance sense, was the introduction of the Freedom of Information Act, which obviously, as we know, still has a compliance problem. Right, many public institutions in Nigeria still don't comply with it. But the reason I say it's so important is because prior to the Freedom of Information Act, the Nigerian government would basically pass a budget, write a budget, pass it through the National Assembly or whatever, and we, the people, did not know or could not know what was in the national budget. So it was basically that the budget will be passed to the National Assembly, and a journalist like yourself, who have maybe friends or contacts in the National Assembly, we then get maybe rough printed drafts or PDF copies of what they said is the budget. We don't even know whether that's the actual budget or not. And then you go report it, and that's all that we had access to. So it's a ridiculous situation, but the introduction of the FYA made it such that for the first time in Nigeria's history as an independent country, Nigerian citizens could actually demand from their government access to information which was in the public interest. So now, even though there's a compliance problem, that has significantly impacted on even the culture of public corruption in Nigeria. There are certain things that could be very easily gotten away with.
So
as recently as
the lack of transparency in just even simple things as budget has hampered on transparency, and in that way, it's sort of exacerbated the situation that we find ourselves.
Absolutely.
Before I let you go, right, because I'm pressed for time and they're in my ears, but I have to ask you this question. There's an article, or rather a post that you posted on X, and this was yesterday at 6, I think it was in the morning, right? Now, at the very bottom of this tweet that you did post on X, you just made statements about this, and I want to ask you, right, and you share the same sentiments with another author that I've spoken to. You said African elites are by and large incompetent at national formation, incapable of sharing power, possess an infinite capacity for pettiness, and lack any willingness to make sacrifices on behalf of the collective or in service to the bigger picture. Any African state whose independence was defined primarily by elite consensus is very likely to be much more dysfunctional than those whose populations actively took part in a shared, organized struggle for freedom. Now, in the latter part of that, our struggle for freedom was by an inclusive, although African elites, but they were all from different parts of the major tribes of Nigeria, right? So Wazobia, Hausa, Yoruba, Igbo. Do you think that that alone was, because you said African elites, and they are the ones, they can't be that, they can't form, national unity, a country, they cannot form a state. Do you think that that was our fundamental or foundational problem that has exacerbated this issue to today, present day Nigeria?
I really do think that. And the reason is very simple. The reason is that the elites who came together to become what is now the Nigerian establishment were people who essentially didn't see themselves they saw themselves in comparison to the regular people, the hoi polloi. They saw themselves in a way that was similar to how even the colonialists would have seen themselves, right? So they were the Europeanized, educated, elite Africans who lived completely separate to how the regular people lived. So if you are creating a country which is going to be dominated in terms of population by those regular people, but you yourself are in no way representative of those regular people, you don't even know how they live. In some cases, you don't even speak the same language. I think it's fair to say, I speak for many of us who grew up in such elite spaces in places like Lagos and Abuja. Many of us don't even speak our native languages anymore. I learned Yoruba outside as an adult.
So then what would it look like in terms of solution? What would that group of people look like that would be solutions in a situation where, dividends of democracy is dispersed to the grassroots? What would it look like? Because the elites sometimes represent education, the educated, the enlightened,
So what I think the solution would be is that the so-called ordinary people have a weapon now which they have never had at any other point in human history. And that weapon is infinite access to infinite information via the internet. So the ordinary people in their ordinariness can become extraordinary in a very short space of time.
How?
So I think we've already started seeing signs, the green shoots of that in Nigeria, where, for example, political formation, political organization, which used to be something that spans decades. All of a sudden, political movements in Nigeria, really powerful political movements, the NSAS movement, the so-called obedient movement, these things came together in weeks. These things have never happened before in Nigerian history. So I think that access to information and that access to widespread communication that allows people to organize in large groups informally in very short spaces of time outside of the control of elite consensus and elite spaces, I think that's where the hope is going to come from. And I think we've already started seeing the green shoots of that.
Well, I mean, like you rightfully put, now more than ever, when you walk down the streets, you see Nigerians, they're all clamoring for change. They are tired. And I do hope that tiredness translates to a pivotal change in the next 3 years.
David,
Same here.
Thank you very much. I want to say that was a very beautiful piece you put up on X yesterday, and I do agree with you regarding the comparison between the DRC and Nigeria and how we got our democracy handed to us by our colonial masters. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you very much for having me.